Hello and welcome to week 2 of Strategic Management of Sport Business. This week's lectures are going to look at internal analysis. So if you watched the video last week and Screencast 1, we looked at the strategic management process. So you should remember this diagram. And last week we looked at the external environment, and we looked at PEST or PESTEL analysis as a framework that allowed us to identify opportunities and threats in the external environment. The focus of this week's lecture is internal analysis, and we are going to be looking at some key tools including functional analysis and value chain analysis, which will allow us to identify the internal strengths and weaknesses of an organisation. And this is our part of our journey to be able to complete SWOT analysis, which is a summary of the strategic position of the organisation. And remember that SWOT analysis says what are the strengths and weaknesses that an organisation has to confront the opportunities and threats presented by the external environment. So, there are 3 learning outcomes for this week. The first is to understand the role of internal analysis in strategy formulation. So, why do we complete internal analysis? And how can an understanding of the internal environment of an organisation shape the strategy that it follows? The second learning objective is understanding the relationship between resources and competencies in organisations which achieve success. So in this lecture, we're going to be discussing a term called competitive advantage. And strategic management theorists explain that competitive advantage means long-term success. If you want long-term success, you have to have the right resources and competencies which are valued by customers to succeed in your industry. So we're going to look at the role that resources and competencies have in achieving success. And the third learning outcome is that we're going to look at some tools and frameworks for analysis, for conducting internal analysis relevant to different types of organisations in the sport industry. So the sport industry contains a wide range of different organisations. They operate in different ways. The way they produce their products and organise their businesses is different. So Nike's business operations look quite different to that of a professional football club, and a professional football club's operations look quite different than that of a gym or a facility operator or somebody like Leisure and Cultural Services Department in Hong Kong. So what I'm going to show you in this lecture, in later screencasts this week, is information and tools for conducting internal analysis for different types of sport organisations. So we're going to begin with trying to understand the importance of internal analysis and where it fits into the strategic management process. So, why is internal analysis important? Well, first of all, it helps us understand the strengths that organisations have developed in order to be successful. It's really quite simple, isn't it, when you think about it? If you want to be better than your competitors, you need to be able to do certain things better. You need to have access to better resources. So we need to understand the way that business operates and what the critical things are that businesses must do well and have strengths in order to be successful. The second thing is closely related to this. Well, if we understand what organisations must do well in order to succeed, if we understand the functions that they must complete, the activities that they must complete, and we understand what it is that is required to do these well so that they have strengths, we also can understand when organisations don't have the necessary resources, where they don't have the necessary skills, and this lack of resources and skills makes them weak. So they have weaknesses, and we will understand by the end of this lecture how strategic weaknesses can contribute to a lack of success or even failure. Internal analysis is also important because, as I mentioned in the second slide of this presentation, it helps us complete the picture of where we are now. So we said the first strategic management question is, where are we now? Next week, when we look at strategic options, we'll ask, where do we want to be and how are we going to get there? But internal analysis helps us complete the question of where we are now. What strengths and weaknesses do we have? And how do we consider those in the context of the opportunities and threats that the external environment presents to us? So this puts us in position, and this is the final point on this slide, to complete SWOT and TOES analysis. And SWOT and TOES analysis are the starting point of strategic decision making. So in this week's live lecture on Thursday, we are going to consider SWOT and TOES analysis, but we can't complete SWOT and TOES analysis until we understand the strengths and the weaknesses from inside the organisation. So the SW of SWOT is generated by internal analysis. Okay, so very briefly, because I've talked about this already during this presentation, internal analysis assesses what an organisation has or doesn't have. So if it has, it's more likely to have strengths. If it doesn't have something, it's more likely to be a weakness. It also assesses what an organisation can or cannot do. It's not enough just to have resources, money, facilities, great players, great marketing, if you don't know what to do with them. So what organisations can or cannot do with the resources available is a really important part of internal analysis. So strengths are comprised of the resources an organisation possesses and the competencies it has developed. We'll see in this lecture that competencies means the ability to use the resources that the organisation has. Weaknesses are resources and competencies that the organisation lacks or is deficient in, it doesn't have enough of, or the quality of its resources or competencies is not good enough to allow it to compete with its competitors in the market. So, I want to just say something at this point about the problems that students often face when conducting internal analysis. So, internal analysis clearly is about looking inside the organisation. And usually managers, when they complete internal analysis, they are doing this from within the organisation. But you are not within the organisation. You will be looking from the outside into the organisation. And this creates a bit of a problem for students because a lot of the information needed to carry out internal analysis is not easy for you to find. It's buried deep in the organisation, its culture, operations processes and confidential data. So, as part of this lecture and as part of this week's screencasts and live lecture, what I need to talk to you and help you explain is, what is it reasonable for us to expect from you when we ask you to conduct internal analysis? Well, we will introduce you to a range of tools. I will introduce you to a range of tools and approaches on how to do internal analysis. We can ask you to take reasonable steps to carry out research into available information. So Screencast 6 and information on Blackboard about organisations that you might base your assignments on will help you. You also need to take responsibility for doing some of your own research, finding some of your own sources. But at the same time, we will acknowledge the limitations on you and that it might be difficult for you to find all of the information that's necessary to do a complete internal analysis. And remember, the point of this module isn't just that you do a piece of work to allow you to pass this module. It's not just about the assessment. It's about equipping you, making you ready to be managers in the sport industry in the future. So we talk to you in this module about how to do internal analysis, not just as students, but as managers completing internal analysis from within the organisation, when you will have insights and access to more information to allow you to do better internal analysis. Okay, so another reason why internal analysis is important is that last week in the lectures we talked about understanding the nature of the environment, and particularly the external environment. And we said that the external environment can be, for sport, can be complex, it can be dynamic, it can be difficult, it can be dangerous, right? And in general, the business environment is becoming more and more complicated and more difficult to predict. And this is driven by things like globalization, technological and social change, and political complications. So the world is becoming more politically complicated. Social change is happening faster now than it used to. Technology and the internet revolution, the third industrial revolution, artificial intelligence, 3D printing is going to change the way that society and work is organised, and globalisation means that changes in one part of the globe have impacts in other parts of the globe in a way that they didn't previously. And all this means that complexity is changing, is becoming more and more prevalent, and is making the external environment for organisations very difficult to predict. So, this raises the question, what can or should organisations do to help themselves deal with the external environment? So, we talked last week about environmental scanning and said it's important, but if things are really so complex that it's difficult to predict and difficult to plan based on the external environment, that means that the internal environment becomes more important. So the first bullet point on this slide says that when the external environment is subject to rapid change, internal resources and capabilities offer a more secure basis for strategy than a market focus. What does this mean? This means that if the world is becoming more complex and more complicated for businesses, managers should not spend all their times trying to deal with and worry about very difficult and complex issues in the external environment. They should dedicate a lot of their time to trying to think about how they can develop skills and resources that put them in a strong position to protect them from environmental threats. Okay, So this idea of looking inside the organisation and focusing inside the organisation is called the resource-based approach to strategy, which says that strategic success is derived from focusing your efforts on trying to develop organisational resources so that they become strengths for you. And the resource-based view of strategy says that resources and capabilities are the primary sources of industry profitability and success for an organisation. Okay, so this is quite different than Michael Porter and the positioning school of strategy. And if you remember, during the live lecture last week, in week 1, we talked about Porter's 5 forces. And we said one of the points of Porter's 5 forces is if the forces are high, then it is difficult to generate a profit and there are more threats than opportunities, and this affects industry profitability. If the forces are low, then there is less competitive rivalry, less competition, and there is greater opportunity to generate profits, and this makes the industry more likely to be a profitable industry for those organisations involved in it. So the resource-based view is quite different than the Porter and the positioning school of strategy. Porter says the Porter's 5 forces and the industry environment affects profitability and the likelihood of success. The resource-based view of strategy says it's less about the external environment and it's more about the strengths and the resources and the competencies that an organisation can develop. That is what will determine the profitability or success. Now, in the real world, obviously, it's bits of both. Yeah, the external environment will create some opportunities and some threats which organisations have to be aware of, but they also need to think about how we improve. We need to understand our strengths. We need to understand how we can turn some of our weaknesses into strengths. So really, real strategy outside of textbooks is a balance of the two approaches. Okay, but the resource-based view has one main advantage in that it helps us understand that managers can control the internal environment, and that we said at the start of this module was about helping you understand why some organisations succeed and some organisations fail. And I said this will teach you about business in general, not just a part of it, not just marketing's contribution to success, not just human resources management contribution to success, but how all these activities can be looked at strategically and activity coordinated to try to develop strengths in marketing, in human resources, in operations, in all the functions and activities of the firm to try to achieve long-term success. Yeah. So this quote says, a major contribution of the resource-based model is that it explains long-lived differences in firm profitability that cannot be attributed to differences in industry conditions. This means it helps us understand what strengths are really important and how to develop strengths and how to avoid weaknesses. So that is really the role of internal analysis, and that is why the resource-based view is important for internal analysis. So just to conclude Screencast 1, what we've said is that internal analysis is the SW of SWOT analysis. And this is why it is important. It forms one of the first parts of any strategic assessment of an organisation. Where are we now? Well, we can't fully answer the question, where are we now, until we answer the internal analysis questions to identify our strengths and weaknesses. And Internal analysis is about understanding and analysing how an organisation develops and uses its competitive advantage. Right? So competitive advantage, we've said, is about long-term superior performance. Okay, so understanding internal analysis and understanding strengths and weaknesses helps an organisation think about how it develops and uses its competitive advantage. So that is the end of Screencast 1.